My name is Cheryl, and at 56 years old, I never thought I would hear those words from my daughter. "You're not my real mother," Amanda screamed. Her face twisted with rage. After 15 years of raising her, loving her, those words cut deeper than any knife. What followed in the next 72 hours would change both our lives forever. If you're watching this from somewhere around the world, please hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. I first met Amanda when she was just 2 years old. Her chubby little hands reached for me the moment I walked into the foster care center. Those big brown eyes looked up at me with such hope, such innocent trust. I knew right then she was meant to be my daughter. My husband William and I had tried for years to have children. Multiple fertility treatments, 3 miscarriages, and endless disappointments had left us emotionally drained. The doctors finally told us what we had feared. I would never be able to carry a child to term. That news broke something in me, but William, always my rock, suggested adoption. "There are so many children who need love, Cheryl," he said, holding my hand as I cried. "We have so much love to give." The adoption process wasn't easy. Mountains of paperwork, home studies, interviews, and waiting. So much waiting. But then came that magical day when we met Amanda. Within months, she was legally ours, and our family was complete. Those early years were filled with such joy. Amanda was a bright, curious child who loved stories and could spend hours arranging her stuffed animals in elaborate tea parties. She was slightly mischievous too, once cutting her own bangs before picture day at preschool, and frequently negotiating extra cookie privileges with her dimpled smile. William was the perfect father. He built her a treehouse in our backyard, taught her to ride a bike, and never missed a single dance recital. Every night he would tuck her in with the same words, "Good night, my shooting star. Dream big." Our life wasn't fancy, but it was rich with love. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Minnesota, the kind of place where neighbors still bring casseroles when someone is sick and children play outside until the streetlights come on. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Then when Amanda was 10, our world shattered. William collapsed while mowing the lawn one hot summer day. A sudden, massive heart attack. The doctors said he never felt pain. One moment he was here, the next he was gone. Just like that, I became a widow and a single mother. Amanda was devastated. She had been Daddy's little girl in every sense. For months she would sit in his favorite chair in the evenings, hugging his old sweater, waiting for him to come home. I was barely holding myself together, but I had to be strong for her. I threw myself into work, expanding my freelance graphic design business to support us. Late nights, after Amanda went to bed, I would sit at my computer designing logos and websites, taking any job that came my way. Sometimes I would catch myself turning to share something with William, only to find an empty space where he should have been. Our neighbor Sophia became my lifeline during those difficult years. A retired teacher in her 70s, she would watch Amanda after school when my work schedule got hectic. Her small house always smelled of freshly baked cookies, and her gentle wisdom helped both Amanda and me navigate our grief. "Children are resilient," Sophia would tell me when I worried about Amanda. "But they also absorb everything around them. Your strength becomes their strength." For a while it seemed like we would be okay. Amanda adjusted to life without her father. She joined the school drama club, made friends with a sweet girl named Tara, who lived down the street and maintained her honor roll status. I was so proud of her resilience, her determination. She had William's spirit. But as Amanda entered her teen years, something began to change. The first signs were subtle. Amanda was 14 when she started coming home later than her curfew. Just 15 minutes at first, with plausible excuses. The drama club rehearsal ran late. She was studying at the library and lost track of time. Small lies that I chose to believe because I wanted to trust my daughter. Then came the changes in her appearance. Gone were the colourful outfits she used to love, replaced with expensive-looking clothes in only black and grey. Her warm smile appeared less frequently, usually replaced by an eye roll or a sigh of exasperation whenever I asked about her day. "Mum, you wouldn't understand," became her standard response to almost everything. When Amanda turned 16, she made new friends at school. Jasmine, Tyler, and Kyle, children from the wealthiest families in our district. Suddenly, my daughter was getting invited to parties at houses with swimming pools and home theatres. At first, I was happy she was expanding her social circle, but something felt off about these new relationships. "They just happen to like the same things I do," Amanda would say defensively whenever I asked about her new friends. "It's not like I'm using them for their money or something." But I noticed how she would come home from Jasmine's house, talking about their home cinema room or the brand new car Jasmine's parents had given her for her 16th birthday. There was a hunger in Amanda's eyes when she described these things, a longing that worried me. "We can't afford a car like that right now, honey," I explained gently after one such conversation. "But if you keep saving from your part-time job at the library, and I put a little aside each month, maybe by next year we can get you something reliable for college." "Whatever," she muttered, storming off to her room. "I'm so sick of always having to wait for everything." The demands for expensive things increased. A $600 prom dress when we had budgeted for 100. The latest smartphone when her current one worked perfectly fine. Designer jeans that cost more than our weekly grocery budget. Each refusal on my part led to longer periods of cold silence or tearful accusations that I didn't want her to fit in. "Everyone has these things, Mum. Everyone except me." I tried explaining our financial situation, how I was still paying off some of William's medical bills, how the house needed a new roof, how her college fund was more important than designer labels. But teenage logic rarely aligns with parental reason. Her grades began to slip. The teacher conferences became more frequent. Amanda was smart, but distracted, they said. Not turning in assignments, texting during class. When I confronted her, she would promise to do better, and for a week or two she would. Then the cycle would start again. One evening, I returned home early from a client meeting to find Amanda and Jasmine trying on my few pieces of good jewelry. Items I had carefully preserved, my grandmother's pearl earrings, the diamond pendant William had given me on our 10th anniversary. "What are you doing in my room?" I demanded, shocked at the invasion of privacy. "Chill, Mum. We were just looking," Amanda said, hastily putting the jewelry back. "It's not like you ever wear this stuff anyway." Later that night, I noticed my pearl earrings were missing. When I confronted Amanda, she swore she had put everything back. I wanted to believe her. The real breaking point came when I discovered my credit card statement showing charges I hadn't made. A $300 pair of shoes. A restaurant bill from a place I'd never been to. When I checked my wallet, my card was there, but someone had clearly used the information. That same week, Amanda came home with a designer handbag I knew cost over $1,000. Jasmine's mum bought it for me as a thank you for helping her organize her charity event. She claimed not quite meeting my eyes. I knew she was lying. Amanda hadn't mentioned any charity event, and she had been struggling to find time for her own homework, let alone volunteer work. The final piece fell into place when I found my personal documents box had been rifled through. The adoption papers were sitting slightly askew, clearly having been examined. My heart sank. I had always planned to have an honest conversation with Amanda about her adoption when she was ready. We had talked about it briefly when she was younger, but I wanted to wait until she was mature enough to understand the complexities of her birth parents' situation. Now someone else had control of that narrative, and I feared what was coming. It was a Friday night in October when everything exploded. Amanda had asked to sleep over at Jasmine's house. and I had reluctantly agreed, making her promise to be home by noon the next day for her grandmother's birthday lunch. Sophia was turning 80, and she adored Amanda. Instead, at 11:30 that night, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, Amanda stood swaying slightly, her eyes unfocused, reeking of alcohol and cigarettes. Behind her, a car sped away, Jasmine's older brother dropping her off without even waiting to see if she got in safely. "What happened? Are you drunk?" I asked, pulling her inside. "Amanda, you're 17. Where were you drinking?" She pushed past me, stumbling toward the stairs. "None of your business," she slurred. "Just leave me alone." "It absolutely is my business." I followed her, my fear turning to anger. "I'm your mother and you're underage. You could have been hurt or arrested or worse." Amanda whirled around, nearly losing her balance. "Oh my God, will you stop with the overprotective act? It's pathetic." Overprotective, Amanda. This isn't about being strict. This is about keeping you safe. That's when I noticed the shopping bags in her hand. Expensive boutiques. Hundreds of dollars worth of clothes we couldn't afford. "Where did you get the money for those?" She smirked, a cold expression I'd never seen on her face before. "Maybe I have people who actually care about me," she said. "People who understand that appearance matters." "What people?" "Those friends who just dropped you off drunk and didn't make sure you got inside safely." "That's not caring, Amanda." I reached for her purse, suddenly suspicious, and before she could stop me, I pulled out my credit card. "You stole from me?" My voice cracked with disbelief. "I borrowed it," she shot back. "I was going to tell you. Like you told me about the earrings you took, or the money missing from my dresser drawer." Her face flushed, not with shame, but with anger. "God, you keep track of everything like some kind of prison guard." "It's just stuff, Mom. Just things you never use anyway." "It's not about the things, Amanda. It's about trust. It's about respect." "Respect?" She laughed bitterly. "That's rich coming from someone living in this dump, working your pathetic little design jobs, pretending we're a normal family." Each word felt like a slap. The home I'd worked so hard to maintain. The career I'd built while raising her alone. "I've done everything I can to give you a good life," I said quietly. "A good life." Her voice rose hysterically. "Do you know what Jasmine's family did last summer? They went to Europe, and I've never even been on a plane. Her dad gives her a credit card with no limit. Her mum buys her whatever she wants. Meanwhile, I'm stuck here with hand-me-down furniture and a mother who thinks Target is a luxury shopping experience." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "We have different circumstances, Amanda. Different doesn't mean worse." "Different." She laughed again, that cold, unfamiliar sound. "Let me tell you about different. Different is having to lie to your friends about why you can't go on spring break to Miami. Different is pretending your mom has an important job when she's really just making logos for small-time businesses that nobody's ever heard of." The shame in her voice when she spoke about our life, about my work, cut deeper than any insult. "I found the papers," she continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I know the truth now." My stomach clenched. "What papers?" "Don't play dumb." "The adoption papers. You're not my real mother. You never were." There it was. The words I had feared for years thrown at me like a weapon. "Amanda, we were always going to talk about this when you were ready." "Ready?" she screamed. "I'm 17. Were you planning to tell me on my deathbed? Or were you just going to keep pretending?" "I wasn't pretending anything. Being your mother is the most real thing in my life." "You lied to me. My whole life is a lie." "I never lied. We talked about your adoption when you were little. You knew you were adopted. I was a child, I didn't understand what it meant. And you never brought it up again. Never. She was right. After those early conversations, when she had seemed satisfied with simple explanations, I had let the topic fade. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps waiting for her to ask again. It had been a mistake. My real mother is probably amazing. Amanda continued building a fantasy before my eyes. She's probably successful and beautiful, and has a real life, not this pathetic excuse for an existence. Amanda, you don't know anything about your birth mother. I know she couldn't be worse than this. At least she had the decency to give me a chance at a better life. Too bad it didn't work out that way. I felt something break inside me. 15 years of love and sacrifice dismissed as worthless. William's memory dishonored. Our family reduced to a pathetic excuse. Your birth mother was a 17-year-old addict who left you alone in a motel room for 3 days before the police found you. I said the words coming out before I could stop them. She had already lost 2 other children to the system. She didn't give you up for a better life. She abandoned you because she couldn't stay clean long enough to feed you. Amanda's face went white. For a moment I saw shock in her eyes, then a hardening. I don't believe you, she whispered. You're lying. Again. She stormed up the stairs, returning minutes later with a backpack. Where are you going? I asked. To Jasmine's. At least her family respects her enough to tell her the truth. Amanda, please, let's talk about this when you're sober. There's nothing to talk about. I'm done with you, with this house, with this whole fake life. She pushed past me toward the door. If you leave now, things will be different when you come back. I warned, my voice steadier than I felt. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, looking back at me with contempt. Good. Different would be an improvement. The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone in the sudden silence. On the floor near the stairs lay my credit card and a receipt for $1,200 worth of clothes. In the kitchen, the calendar mocked me with Sophia's birthday lunch circled in red. And in my heart, a decision was forming, one that terrified me, but one I knew I had to make. I picked up my phone and texted Jasmine's mother. Amanda is coming to your house. She's been drinking. Please let me know she arrived safely. The reply came quickly. Not our problem. We're not a homeless shelter. As I stood in my living room surrounded by the photos of our life together, Amanda's first day of school, her middle school graduation, William holding her on his shoulders at the state fair, I knew what I had to do. It would be the hardest thing I'd ever done as a mother. But sometimes the most loving choice isn't the easiest one. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My daughter was out there somewhere angry and hurt, believing I had somehow cheated her out of a better life. Part of me wanted to track her down immediately and bring her home to hold her close and promise everything would be okay. But another part knew that would solve nothing. We would be right back in this same situation next week, next month. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, a cup of cold tea in front of me, thinking about William. What would he have done? He had always been the disciplinarian in our family, the one who could say no and stick to it, even when Amanda turned on the charm. Kids need boundaries, he would say. They push against them to make sure they're solid. It's how they feel safe. Had I failed to maintain those boundaries after he died? Had my guilt over Amanda losing her father made me too permissive, too eager to avoid any further pain in her life? Around 6 in the morning, I called Sophia. Despite the early hour, she answered on the second ring. It's Amanda, isn't it? She asked, instead of saying hello. Sophia had always been perceptive. I poured out everything. The credit card theft, the cruel words, the revelation about the adoption papers. By the end, I was crying again. I don't know what to do, Sophia. I feel like I'm losing her. There was a long pause before Sophia spoke. When my Thomas was 17, he stole my car, she said finally. Took it joyriding with his friends and wrapped it around a telephone pole. Nobody was hurt, thank God, but the car was totaled. I had never heard this story before, though I'd known Sophia for years. What did you do? I asked. I let him face the consequences. My late husband wanted to bail him out, pay for everything, ground him for a month and move on. But I said no. Thomas had to get a job to pay for the damages. He had to face the judge in court. He spent 100 hours picking up trash along the highway. And it worked. Sophia chuckled softly. He's a judge now himself. Tells me that summer of community service changed his perspective on everything. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is letting them feel the weight of their own choices. After we hung up, I made 2 more calls. First to a family lawyer I had consulted after William died, asking about my legal options regarding Amanda's behavior. Second to Amanda's school, speaking with the principal about what had happened. Then I sat down and wrote a letter to my daughter. 8 pages, front and back, pouring out everything. How William and I had fallen in love with her the moment we saw her. The struggles of her early years, when nightmares would wake her screaming. The truth about her birth parents, not as a weapon, but as her history, something she deserved to know. I wrote about my own failures as a mother, especially after William died. How I had tried to fill the void of his absence by indulging her avoiding conflict, hoping that things would improve naturally. I sealed the letter in an envelope with her name on it and placed it on her bed. By 9 o'clock, my plan was set. I cancelled my credit cards, froze my bank accounts to which Amanda had access, and called the phone company to restrict her cell phone to only emergency calls. I contacted the parents of Amanda's new friends, calmly explaining that she had been stealing from me and lying about our family situation. Most were shocked. A few seemed unsurprised. Then I waited. I knew Amanda would eventually have nowhere to go but home. And when she did, the real parenting would begin. Day 1 of what I came to think of as the 72-hour intervention began at 2 in the afternoon when Amanda finally returned home. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep, probably both. She dropped her backpack by the door with a deliberate thud, a small act of defiance. "Jasmine's mom kicked me out," she announced as if this were somehow my fault. "And my credit card doesn't work." "It's not your credit card," I replied calmly, looking up from my laptop where I was working on a client project. "It's mine, and I've cancelled it." Amanda's face flushed. "You can't do that." "I already have, along with restricting your phone to emergency calls only and informing the school about your behavior." "You what?" Her voice rose to a shriek. "You told my school—" "Yes. Principal Harmon and I had a lengthy conversation this morning. You've been suspended for a week for violating the school's honor code." "What honor code? I didn't cheat on a test or something." "Theft is a violation of the honor code, Amanda. So is providing alcohol to minors, which Jasmine's brother admitted to when her parents confronted him. You're both suspended." She stared at me in disbelief. "You're ruining my life." "No. I'm helping you face the consequences of your choices. There's a difference." Amanda stormed toward the stairs, no doubt heading for her room to call her friends or look for something else to sell or steal. I stood up. "One more thing," I said. "I've moved your things to the guest room for now, and I've taken your car keys." That stopped her. The car had been a gift for her 16th birthday, a used Honda Civic that William and I had saved for since she was 12. It wasn't new or flashy, but it was reliable, and it had been her pride and joy until recently, when she started comparing it unfavorably to her friends' more expensive vehicles. "You can't take my car," she said, her voice suddenly small. "It's mine." It's registered in my name. You can earn back driving privileges when you demonstrate responsibility. For a moment, I saw a flash of the little girl who used to run to me with scraped knees and butterfly sightings, looking bewildered and a little lost. Then the hardness returned to her face. "I hate you," she whispered. "You're not my mother. You've never been my mother." I had prepared myself for those words, but they still hurt. "I am your mother in all the ways that matter," I said steadily. "And part of being your mother is teaching you that actions have consequences. You can hate me right now if you need to. I can handle that. What I can't handle is watching you throw away your future because no one cared enough to set boundaries." She fled upstairs, then slamming the guest room door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. I heard drawers being yanked open, muffled screaming into what was probably a pillow. I gave her space. This was only the beginning. Day 2 dawned with Amanda discovering more consequences. When she tried to log into her social media accounts, she found the passwords changed. When she attempted to use the Wi-Fi, she discovered it now required a password she didn't have. Her laptop and tablet had been moved to my room, leaving her only her restricted phone. "This is abuse," she shouted at breakfast, which consisted of plain oatmeal instead of the sugary cereal she preferred. "I could call child services. You're welcome to use your phone to call them," I replied, sliding a printed copy of the state's legal definition of child abuse across the table. "You'll find that providing shelter, food, clothing, and appropriate discipline while removing privileges earned through responsible behavior does not qualify." She didn't call anyone. Instead, she spent the morning sulking in the guest room. Around noon, I knocked on her door. "Get dressed. We're going somewhere." "I'm not going anywhere with you," she muttered into her pillow. "Yes, you are. We can do this the easy way with you dressed and in the car in 15 minutes, or the hard way with me donating your entire wardrobe to the shelter downtown and replacing it with clothes of my choosing. Your call." 20 minutes later, we were in the car. Amanda slumped in the passenger seat, staring out the window, refusing to ask where we were going. I drove in silence until we reached the outskirts of the city, where the neighborhoods grew progressively more run down. Finally, I parked in front of a dilapidated apartment building with boarded-up windows on the ground floor. "Why are we here?" Amanda finally asked, looking nervously at the men loitering near the entrance. "This is where your birth mother lived," I said quietly. "Her name was Lisbeth Kearney. She was 17 when she had you already addicted to heroin and meth. Your biological father was her dealer, a 30-year-old man named Ray, who was arrested for domestic violence 3 months before you were born." Amanda's face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the building. "When the police found you in that motel room, you were severely dehydrated and had a respiratory infection that had gone untreated for days. You spent 2 weeks in the hospital before entering foster care." "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because it's your history and you deserve to know it. Not as a punishment, but as the truth. Lisbeth gave up her parental rights from jail. She died of an overdose 4 years later." I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph of a young woman with Amanda's eyes and chin. Despite the track marks visible on her arms and the unhealthy pallor of her skin, she had once been beautiful. "This is the only picture of her in your file," I said, handing it to Amanda. "She was smart according to her juvenile records, good at math. She wanted to be a veterinarian when she was little." Amanda stared at the photo, her fingers tracing the face of the stranger who had given her life. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice small. "Life happened, Amanda. Hard choices, bad influences, no one to pull her back from the edge when she started falling." We sat in silence for a long time, looking at the building where Lisbeth had spent her brief, troubled life. Finally, I started this car. I'm not showing you this to hurt you, I said as we pulled away. I'm showing you because I want you to understand what love really looks like. Love isn't about expensive gifts or saying yes to everything. Sometimes love is saying no. Sometimes it's telling hard truths. Sometimes it's doing everything in your power to make sure someone doesn't end up in a place like this, even if they hate you for it in the moment. Amanda didn't respond, but she kept the photograph, slipping it into her pocket as we drove home. Day 3 began earlier than the previous days. I woke Amanda at 6:30, telling her to dress in comfortable clothes she didn't mind getting dirty. The resentment in her eyes had been replaced by a wary confusion, but she complied without argument. We drove to the other side of the city, to a youth centre in one of the poorest neighbourhoods. Inside, the walls were bright with children's artwork, but the furniture was worn and the supplies were clearly donated and mismatched. "What is this place?" Amanda asked as I signed us in at the front desk. "Hope House. It's a drop-in centre for at-risk youth and children in the foster system. We're volunteering for the day." Before she could protest, a harried-looking woman approached us with a grateful smile. "You must be Cheryl and Amanda. Thank God you're here. 2 of our regular volunteers called in sick, and we're short-handed for the Saturday program. Amanda, would you mind helping in the art room? The little ones are making collages, but they need someone to supervise the scissors and glue." And just like that, Amanda was whisked away to a room full of 5 to 7-year-olds, many of whom immediately clamoured for her attention. I was assigned to the kitchen preparing lunch for the 60 children who would cycle through the centre that day. From my vantage point, I could occasionally glimpse Amanda through the doorway. At first, she was stiff and uncomfortable, holding herself apart from the children. But gradually, as the morning progressed, I saw her defences lowering. A small girl with beaded braids climbed into her lap to show her a picture. A boy with a faded bruise on his cheek proudly held up his collage for her approval. By lunchtime, Amanda was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by children helping a tiny boy with glasses carefully cut out pictures from a magazine. During the lunch break, Amanda was quiet, picking at her sandwich. "There's a girl here who's been in 12 foster homes," she finally said. "She's only 14. I nodded. "Maria. She helps with the younger kids every Saturday." She asked me if I was going to come back next week. Amanda continued, her voice neutral. "She said they never have enough volunteers. Would you like to—" She shrugged. But it wasn't the dismissive gesture I'd grown accustomed to. It was thoughtful, considering. The afternoon was spent cleaning up the centre and organising donations. Amanda was paired with Maria to sort through bags of used clothing, deciding what could be offered to the children and what was too worn to be useful. I overheard snippets of their conversation, Maria matter-of-factly describing her life in the system, Amanda listening with growing awareness of her own privilege. On the drive home, Amanda broke the long silence. "Did you and Dad consider any other kids at the adoption centre, I mean?" It was the first time she had mentioned William without bitterness since our fight. "No," I said honestly. "We met you and that was it. There was never any question in our minds." She nodded, looking out the window. "I found the letter," she said after another long pause. "The one you wrote." My heart skipped a beat. "Did you read it?" "Some of it. I couldn't finish it yet." "Take your time. It's yours to read when you're ready." We drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Less hostile, more contemplative. When we arrived home, Amanda went straight to the guest room without slamming the door. That night, around 11, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. When I opened it, Amanda stood there in her pajamas, her face streaked with tears, holding my 8-page letter in her trembling hands. "Mom," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I pulled her into my arms, and for the first time in years, my daughter let me hold her as she cried. The conversation that followed lasted until nearly dawn. We sat on my bed, surrounded by tissues and the photo albums I had pulled from the closet, visual documentation of our life together, the good and the difficult. I don't even know why I said those things, Amanda admitted, looking at a picture of herself at age 10, sitting on William's shoulders at a baseball game. I don't really think our life is pathetic. But part of you has been unhappy, I said gently. That didn't come from nowhere. She traced the edge of the photograph with her finger. When Dad died, everything changed. And then when I started high school, it was like suddenly everyone cared about what you wore and where you vacationed and what kind of car your parents drove. I just wanted to fit in. Why didn't you talk to me about how you were feeling? Amanda's eyes welled with fresh tears. You were always working so hard. You looked so tired all the time. I didn't want to be another problem for you to solve. My heart ached at the realization that my daughter had been protecting me in her own way by hiding her struggles. I started hanging out with Jasmine and her friends because they made me feel special at first, she continued. Like I was chosen. But then it turned into this constant pressure. I had to dress like them, talk like them, have the same things they had. When I couldn't keep up, they would make these little comments. What kind of comments? Just stuff about my clothes being last season, or how cute it was that I got excited about going to the local lake when they were all going to Hawaii. Little digs that made me feel less than. And you started lying to them about our life. She nodded, shame coloring her cheeks. I told them you were an executive who worked from home, that Dad had left us a big insurance policy, that we chose to live in a smaller house because we were saving for a vacation home in Florida. Oh, Amanda. I know it was wrong, she whispered. It just got out of control. And then when I found the adoption papers, it was like everything made sense in a twisted way. Like maybe I was meant for a different life with different parents, and somehow I'd ended up in the wrong place. Do you still feel that way? I asked, holding my breath. She shook her head fiercely. No, God, no. After today, seeing those kids at the center, hearing Maria's stories about foster care, I kept thinking about how lucky I was that you and Dad found me, that you wanted me, that you chose me. We looked through more albums, Amanda's dance recitals, school plays, birthday parties. The camping trip where it rained the entire time, but William had made it an adventure, teaching Amanda how to identify animal tracks in the mud. The Christmas morning when she was 8 and got the bicycle, she had been dreaming of her face, a perfect picture of joy. I found Dad's watch, Amanda said quietly, turning to a photo of William wearing the vintage timepiece he had inherited from his father. I was going to pawn it to buy a dress for Jasmine's birthday party. The admission clearly cost her shame, making her voice tremble. But I couldn't do it. I kept hearing his voice in my head, telling me that some things are worth more than money. He would be proud of you for making that choice, I said, squeezing her hand. Even in your angriest moments, something in you knew what mattered. As the night deepened, we talked about more difficult things. The trust that had been broken, the money she had stolen, the lies she had told. We worked out a repayment plan for the missing funds. She would get a real job, not just the few hours at the library, and pay back every penny. And the car? She asked tentatively. That's going to take longer to earn back, I said firmly. Trust is like a vase, Amanda. Once it's broken, you can glue it back together, but it takes time and care. She nodded, accepting this consequence with a maturity I hadn't seen in her for years. What about school? You'll serve your suspension. When you return, you'll meet weekly with the guidance counselor. And your phone and internet privileges will remain limited until I see consistent responsibility. Instead of arguing, she surprised me. That's fair, she said. More than fair, considering what I did. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside my window, Amanda asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. Do you still love me? After everything I said, everything I did. I took her face in my hands. This beautiful child who had brought such joy and pain into my life, this young woman standing at the crossroads of who she would become. Amanda Marie Lawson, listen to me. There is nothing, nothing you could ever do or say that would make me stop loving you. You are my daughter, not by blood, but by choice, by love, by every day we've spent together since you came into my life. That bond is unbreakable, even when it's tested. Even when I said you weren't my real mother. Even then, especially then, because being a real mother isn't about giving birth. It's about showing up every day through the beautiful moments and the brutal ones. It's about loving someone enough to do what's right for them, not what's easy. She hugged me then tight and desperate, like she used to when she was small and woke from a nightmare. I want to be better, she whispered against my shoulder. I want to be the person you and Dad raised me to be. You will be, I promised. One day at a time. The changes didn't happen overnight. Real transformation never does. But over the next 6 months, Amanda and I rebuilt our relationship on a stronger foundation of honesty and mutual respect. She got a job at a local bakery, working 20 hours a week while maintaining her studies. Every payday, she would solemnly hand me a portion of her check to repay what she had taken. I put that money directly into her college fund, though I didn't tell her that. The lesson was in the giving, not in where the money ultimately went. Her suspension from school turned out to be a blessing in disguise. When she returned, she distanced herself from Jasmine, and that crowd reconnecting instead with her old friend Tara and joining the yearbook committee. Her grades improved steadily, and by spring she was back on the honor roll. The car remained in the garage for 3 months before I allowed her limited driving privileges, school and work only with a strict curfew. She never complained about the restriction, seeming to understand that it was a natural consequence of her actions. Most Saturdays we volunteered together at Hope House. Amanda had formed a special bond with Maria, the 14-year-old foster child, helping her with homework and listening to her dreams of becoming a doctor someday. Watching my daughter mentor this wounded, hopeful girl was one of the greatest joys of my life. On Amanda's 18th birthday, we had a small celebration at home. Sophia came, of course, bringing her famous lemon cake. Tara and a few of Amanda's new friends from the yearbook committee joined us. It wasn't an extravagant party by any measure. No DJ, no catered food, none of the Instagram-worthy decorations Amanda might have once demanded. Just people who genuinely cared about her gathered around our dining table. After cake, Amanda handed me a small, carefully wrapped package. It's not much, she said nervously, but I wanted you to have it. Inside was a handmade photo album. On the cover, in Amanda's neat handwriting, were the words, "My real mother." The pages inside held photographs of us throughout the years, along with ticket stubs, birthday cards, and other mementos I hadn't even realized she had saved. At the back was a letter 3 pages long, thanking me for not giving up on her when she was at her worst. I ran into Jasmine at the mall last week. Amanda told me later that evening as we cleaned up from the party. She was with her mum buying stuff for college. How was that? Amanda shrugged. Weird. They were both so fake nice, asking about my plans like they actually cared. Jasmine's going to some expensive private school her dad's alumni at. She made sure to mention the tuition. And how did that make you feel? I asked carefully. To my surprise, Amanda laughed. Honestly, I felt sorry for her. She's never had to work for anything. Everything just gets handed to her. How will she ever know what she's capable of? My heart swelled with pride. This was the real victory. Not that Amanda had learned to value the simpler life we led, but that she had learned to value herself apart from material possessions. A few weeks later, an acceptance letter arrived from the state university along with a partial scholarship. It wasn't the Ivy League school some of her classmates were heading to, but it was a solid education that we could afford, with her scholarship, her savings, and my contribution. The night after the letter came, I found Amanda sitting in William's old armchair holding his watch. "Dad would have been really excited about this, wouldn't he?" she asked as I joined her. "Absolutely thrilled," I confirmed. "He always said you were destined for wonderful things. I wish he could have seen me graduate." "He sees you," I said softly. "Not in some supernatural way, but in the values you carry forward, in the kind of person you're becoming. That's how people live on, through the impact they have on those who loved them." Amanda nodded her fingers, tracing the worn leather of the watch band. "I've been thinking about starting a support group," she said suddenly, "at school for kids who are adopted or in foster care. A place where they can talk about stuff they might not be able to discuss with their parents. Maybe prevent someone else from making the mistakes I did." The idea was so perfectly Amanda, taking her pain and transforming it into something that could help others. "I think that's a beautiful idea," I told her. "Your experience could make a real difference for other kids." "I learned from the best," she said, smiling at me. "A real mother doesn't just protect you from pain, she teaches you how to grow through it." Those words coming from the same mouth that had once hurled, "You're not my real mother," at me like a weapon were the most profound gift I could have received. They were proof that the hardest 72 hours of my parenting life had been worth every painful minute. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love, by showing up, by doing the hard work of helping each other become our best selves. Sometimes that means making tough choices. Sometimes it means letting the people we love experience the natural consequences of their actions. And sometimes it means loving someone enough to be the villain in their story until they're ready to see the truth. Have you ever had to make a difficult parenting decision that felt wrong in the moment, but proved right in the long run? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Remember, the hardest choices we make as parents often become the greatest gifts we give our children. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all the courage to love fiercely, even when it's difficult.